It's great to be collaborating with you again, Bob. As he noted, it was about over 10 years ago that he and I worked together. So it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be in Washington, and it's a pleasure to talk about this. I'm glad that we set the time frames of several centuries to millennia. Solutions easy in a couple of years. Be all good. No, in fact, that is somewhat of the time frame that I'm going to be talking about because, and as you'll hear in a moment too, this all has political dimensions. And on the one hand, on the one hand, we've been talking very science-rich conversations, and I think within the scientific community, there's a notion that many of the things that you've seen today, the graphs, the data, is truth in some kind of way. That there's a truth about it. But when you get in the messy and sometimes ugly world of politics or communities or people with jobs at stake, there are many different truths. There are many different ways of understanding the world and then, of course, how to respond to the world. So I love this quote from Moby Dick. It is not down in any map. True places never are. What is a true place? You go to any spot that's on a map, and you will have a very different view of it than the people who grew up there and live there, or who's had centuries or millennia of ancestors who've lived there. So I think there's the way of thinking about the interaction of science and society and decision-making is very nuanced. So I want to take, I'm now in academia, so I guess I have to like pull apart things that have been said before me, right? Actually, when I was in academia, I hated that aspect. Like everyone. So I want to provide a friendly amendment to John's pyramid, and I don't have a picture of it now. But if you could go next, I'm not quite. Oh, sorry. If we don't want that. That scared me. Okay. So I'm trying to think where we scientists traditionally think of that pyramid. Information rich at the bottom that scientists are producing, and it wells up sometimes very actively, sometimes less actively, in a kind of unidirectional way until at the apex of this pyramid, there are decision makers that are making decisions. And while I think it's useful to think of it that way, I want to think about it in a slightly more nuanced way. And that is a way in which there are multiple directions from decision makers to science, that there's politics engaged, etc. And one of the things that when Bob and I were at the Kennedy School and the team that we were working on looked at science in this way where you think about that, and many scientists feel, how can my science be used better? And we came up with this, this framework. It may work, it may not work. I have found it pretty useful, where you've got to have these three pieces of information for it to make a difference, for people to use it for decision making. Salience is this information that the decision maker wants or needs? And there's so many places where you can think of scientists doing reports, but they're not really answering the question that a decision maker is interested in. So that's one piece. Credibility is the piece that I think scientists are the most understanding about, because that's what historically has been their currency. Peer review, credible. I'm using the right methods. I'm using the right tools. I'm using the right models. Do other people in my field think this makes sense? All of those kinds of things. Without credibility, you can't have decision making based on information. And then legitimacy is probably the one that is A, the hardest, and B, the one that's ignored. And that's about what's the process that information development goes through. Who was engaged at what time? How is it communicated? How are the scope of research set? Who are parties at the table? All of these things are critically important, particularly as you get to more and more complicated kinds of issues like the ones that we're dealing with right now. So I'm going to tell two stories from my time in state government that shows a disastrous failure and something that has been very successful. So the disastrous failure was on fisheries. So the fisheries folks who are in the next panel, I'm really looking forward to you commenting on what I'm saying. So this is a picture, as I was preparing for this, I dug up some old articles from the New Bedford Standard Times. New Bedford is the most economically viable fishing city in the whole country. mostly dependent on scallops. New Bedford's in southern Massachusetts, but we also have cities you might have heard of, Gloucester, Salem, etc. Also very dependent on fisheries, though not as healthy as New Bedford. This is Governor Patrick on the left, Mayor of New Bedford, Mayor Lang on the right. I had just noticed that, like, there I am in the right over there. Yeah, holding all the documents that the governor, whoops, and making sure he stays out of trouble. In fact, I should just divert for a tiny little story. We were visiting a cod fishing boats here, and there was a very famous cod fisherman who was, again, in the news. In fact, people called him the cod father. True. And it's just me and the governor's media person, and the godfather, who's going into his boat. We climb up into the top of the boat, and he's bemoaning the fact that the scientists from NOAA have not been responsive, they haven't been helpful, they don't trust them. And at one point, I'm not going to use the person's name, I'll just say Dr. Smith. At one point he says, "Governor, I wish Dr. Smith was 6 feet under." And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, we can't have like newspapers here, or basically hearing somebody threaten a federal scientist. It was very nerve-wracking, but we knew we weren't talking, he was joking. And anyway, so like very contested issues going on here. And that was about science, right? He was unhappy with the scientists, not with the regulator. So very interesting. So as I was the governor's key fisheries person here, I had this background in how science is used and can best be used. And I realized the regulatory system here is so fractured, so political. Let's start a debate about information. Instead of NOAA producing cod assessments every year, giving them to the fishermen who undoubtedly say, no, 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 they're wrong. I was out in the boat today. I caught so much. What are they talking about? Why don't we do some kind of cooperative research? And again, folks from NOAA, from NSF who are around here, they've supported that kind of research in many parts of the country on many different kinds of things. So we put this proposal together to get the NOAA fishing scientists, the fishing community, our state fishing scientists in a broad, cooperative, multiple stakeholder meetings. Let's set the agenda. And my goal was that in 2 or 3 years, when an assessment came out that said the cod populations were declining, if that were the case, that the fishermen would say, yeah, I know, I trust that data because there were my boats that were collecting the information. Or I was asked at the beginning whether the model made sense. So it would change the conversation then to talk about what are the mechanisms. Do catch shares work? Do they not work? Instead, there was this very divisive kind of feeling of not trusting the scientific information. So we proposed this to NOAA, and there was, at varying levels, there was a lot of support for it. It went months and months and months. We held news conference. There we go. So we had a big announcement where we asked for $3.2 million, not a lot of money, to do this cooperative research program. This was in June of 2009. We went back and forth with NOAA and with NIMS, with the local folks, with headquarters. It was a very frustrating time. And at the end of the day, NOAA said no. And you could see the prediction of what happened, what we were concerned about what happened over the next 4 or 5 years. And by the way, the reason we had heard was that local NOAA scientists didn't trust enough the state scientists to even sit down at the same table, which of course is exactly why this should have happened. So here's what, and I'm not going to go into the details, here's what ensued. In January 2010, it was denied, and then we had articles like this. This is 2010, assumption used in the mandate. So assumptions weren't discussed. They weren't risk neutral, but they were risk averse. Fishing communities weren't at the table to help understand what risk was. Fishing data, it's not what it is. I mean, it is what it is, except when it's not. And these are headlines in the local papers just showing a continued distrust. 2012, doubts grow over cod study. Council scientist questions data. Fish assessments usually don't get yield right, says study. And this continues on and on and on. And this is where we are now. New call for outside review of NOAA assessments. So here was an effort to understand salience, credibility, and legitimacy, and how it interacts with the pyramid that John talked about, and we couldn't get anywhere. And we're at the same place in New England that we've been now for decades. Very frustrating. Okay, but here is a good story. So in 2008, toward the beginning of Governor Patrick's administration, working with local communities all along the coast, working with places like Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Susan Avery is here. She was part of these discussions. We passed an Oceans Management Act that required a planning process that was so stakeholder rich and so stakeholder heavy. We know that the state people that worked on it found it excruciatingly painful and yet very, very valuable. It took 1.5 years to make this plan. We were the first state, I think, to do this, a plan like this. 18 public meetings, 90 stakeholder consultants, review periods, written comments, informational meetings. We had an Ocean Advisory Commission and we had a Scientific Advisory Council. The council was there to get credibility. Let's get the best scientists on coastal and oceans issues at the table, the most credible scientists. The Advisory Commission, let's make sure the process is legitimate. Let's have mayors from coastal towns. Let's have NGOs, environmental NGOs, fishing associations. All of the major players should be there. The clean energy companies, because we were thinking about wind farms off the coasts. As many people as we could think came to the table to have what we wanted to be was a very legitimate process. And that is, in fact, what happened. The first Ocean Management Plan came out in 2010, and it was rich with data, rich with maps. It gave a framework for moving forward on making contested decisions, whether they were about who could use the waters for fisheries, for wind farms, for mining. Sand mining is what happens, is the mining that happens on our coastal waters. And it was ended up with all of these things that we were hoping it would at the end. That is, the science was broadly trusted. People did not complain that this wasn't peer-reviewed, that there weren't the right scientists at the table with the right expertise. The decisions options were much less contested. This doesn't get rid of contestation, right? Contestation is an important part of the decision-making process. But it allowed for one part of the contestation, that is the knowledge, the information, the science, to not be contested as much. There was little obstruction to any decisions that were made based on this, and the decision options balanced multiple interests, the fishing interest, the clean energy interest, the recreation interest, all of those kinds of things. And therefore, the decisions now are much more robust. They're going to last longer, they're economically more robust, they're socially, they're politically more robust. And again, think back to the fisheries example. Every time there's a regulatory decision that's either made at the NIMS level or at the Fisheries Council level, which is a process that engages the fishing industry, every time there's a regulatory change, it's not robust. It's countered, it's fought, it becomes a political lightning rod, and that hasn't happened with some of the things that came from the Ocean Plan. So here's an example. This is the Massachusetts coast, Cape Cod, you can see. By the way, it was very heartening when I walked in this building. That statue that's right in the lobby is from Concord, Massachusetts, which is right at the edge of this map here. That's a nice little piece of history there. But you can see there are multiple layers here that are different uses. There's in both ecosystem values and actions that humans take. So this shows where there's eelgrass. It shows where there's right whale habitat. It shows where there's commercial fisheries and recreational fisheries. Overlay upon overlay upon overlay. And this is not a zoning exercise. What it is it allows for a decision such as if we have offshore wind south of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, those two islands at the bottom, where will this tell us to put them? Still haven't figured out how to use the laser pointer on this. Is it the middle finger?
Yeah.
Ooh, there we go. Okay, so for those of you looking at that one, look at the yellow pieces there. The yellow pieces, after you looked at that overlay in the previous one, this avoids eelgrass. It avoids commercial shipping lanes, etc. And these would potentially be the transmission lines coming from these huge areas, which are federal waters, where there are now leases for offshore wind. And a lot of offshore wind, if you want to talk about clean energy, 30,000 megawatts potential of offshore wind. The entire demand for New England is 26,000 megawatts. So you can see interesting interactions. But what we've had is a non-contested discussion about where transmission lines may be able to come in. And it provides the state and federal agencies during the permitting process a much better handle on how to move forward. So just to conclude, when we think about the pyramid of information coming up to decision making, I think we should think about it in a much more nuanced way that takes into account salience, credibility, and legitimacy. And now someone who's back in academia, it's something that's on my mind all the time. And we've just at UMass Boston created this thing called the Sustainable Solutions Lab, which is interdisciplinary, but unlike in many other universities, direct ties with communities all over Massachusetts in terms of driving our research agenda so we can answer sustainability type questions to the best of our ability as scientists, but with the mind toward solving problems at the community level. Thank you.